Good morning, my name is Bruce Lindsey. Today I'll be giving my Rotary classification speech. I want to start off by talking about where I grew up, because that background has a lot to do with where I am today. I grew up in a rural area of Pennsylvania. Many people think of the east coast of the United States as being heavily populated, which is true in some cases along the coast. However, inland, there are many rural areas. The small town where I grew up was in the middle of a region of the United States known as Appalachia. Appalachia is often characterized by higher rates of poverty, and that is due to the geographic isolation. I actually grew up on a small farm outside of this small town. On the left you can see the view out my front window towards the small town, and on the right you can see a picture out the back towards the farm and towards the hill where we owned a 100-acre farm. My father was not a full-time farmer. He worked for the United States Department of Agriculture as a soil conservationist. So from my very youngest years, I remember learning about the importance of conservation and the interaction between humans and the landscape. When we traveled from even one small town to the next, we had to go through regions like this. This is part of what I mentioned earlier about the geographic isolation. Because of this, many of the people that I grew up with never left the county they were born in. I was very fortunate, however, that my parents traveled a lot with myself and my siblings, and I was able to see many of the other states of the country. Here are some of the things I did when I was growing up in this small town. I participated in Boy Scouts and I became an Eagle Scout. I worked on our farm and I worked on every other farm in the neighborhood. I was a camp counselor. I played football in the high school football team, and I was a member of the band and in a lot of other activities in the school. After I graduated from high school, I attended the Penn State University where I received a BS in agricultural engineering. I attended Penn State under an ROTC scholarship. That is a program where the United States military pays for the tuition of the student, and after graduation, the student becomes a commissioned officer in the armed forces. I became commissioned officer as a second lieutenant in the United States Marine Corps. The Marine Corps sent me all the way across the country to California, where I spent 8 years. But that didn't turn out so bad because that's where I met my wife. We were married in California, and we started our family there. So at this time, I'm going to break the progression of my career and introduce you to my family. So to start off with, this is a picture of my wife and I now. My wife is a very successful businesswoman. She started her own business and has been doing that for 25 years. She's also the Rotarian of the family. I was introduced to Rotary through my wife. Our oldest son is married. This is Chris and his wife Kara. Our middle son is the only one who's not married. This is Kurt. And our youngest daughter, Emily, and her husband, Ben. So now I'll go back to discussing my career in the Marine Corps. While I was in the Marine Corps, I was not in California the whole time. I was deployed several times to the Western Pacific region. It seems like we were always in the snow, the desert, or the jungle. One of the things that I learned was that when we deployed, we did not go to the nicest places in the world. We saw the underbelly of society. The upper left corner is a picture of a young family in the Philippines. They were basically subsistence farmers. They had a few chickens and some vegetables. Somewhere out in the jungle, they were squatters. They did not own the land that they lived on. Everywhere we went, we saw these kinds of things, and it really helped us understand how the rest of the world lives. After 8 years in the Marine Corps, I decided to switch careers, and I got a job with the U.S. Geological Survey. I started working with the National Water Quality Assessment Program, which studies groundwater quality, surface water quality, and ecological conditions all across the United States. My first job with that career was a groundwater sampling team leader. We sampled for hundreds and hundreds of constituents, VOCs, pesticides, nutrients, major ions, radionuclides, and microbial contaminants. I soon became the lead of the team and eventually became the project chief for that program. From the time I began work with the USGS as a hydrologist, I was working in the lower Susquehanna River Basin, which is highlighted here. After several years working in this region, I was designated a principal aquifer lead scientist and given responsibility for studies in these aquifers of the United States known as the Piedmont and the Valley and Ridge region. Later, I became the regional analyst for the entire Atlantic region, which includes all the aquifers up and down the East Coast. And I'm responsible for data collection, understanding the status, and the trends in groundwater quality across that region. In addition, I have the responsibility to analyze trends in groundwater quality across the United States. I became the Groundwater Trends Coordinator several years ago, and I do all the analysis of the data that have been collected across the United States to determine whether water quality is improving or getting worse for many constituents across the United States. Some of the research that I've done with the U.S. Geological Survey includes studies of groundwater quality, specifically microbial quality, that is, the movement of viruses and bacteria into and through the groundwater and how they affect drinking water quality. I've also done research on the relationships between well construction and the microbial quality of groundwater. And in addition, I've studied naturally occurring contaminants that occur from materials being dissolved from the rocks themselves and how that affects groundwater quality. In all of my dealings with the E-Club, however, I will have to always give a caveat that I'm speaking as a private citizen and not a representative of the USGS. I want to talk a little bit about my experiences with Rotary, how I got involved with Rotary, and some of the experiences that I've had. I have to really go back to the Rotary Exchange Program. I had to put this separate from my family because if I started talking about my exchange students before I talked about my family, you might not think I had a family because I would just go on and on about my exchange students. My first exchange student was from India. We had another one from Finland. There are two from Argentina, one from Thailand, one from Honduras, and one from Denmark. So they are not just flags that are on the wall in our living room. They are actual people, so I'll introduce you to them. This is Anvi. She was our exchange student from India, and you'll see in most of these pictures our daughter, who was the best friend and ambassador for most of our exchange students. Vera is our exchange student from Finland. She has definitely been adopted by our family. She's one of our daughter's best friends and was in our daughter's wedding, and we have seen her every single year since she left the United States 8 years ago. Noon is our exchange student from Thailand, a wonderful young woman. We have two exchange students from Argentina, and they're kind of in a special category because they weren't actually our exchange students. Emmanuel was an actual Rotary exchange student, and we got to know him quite well, although he did not actually stay with us. But he came back 2 years later with his sister, Luciana, on the left, as a work exchange study, and they spent pretty much their entire time with us during that exchange, and we got to know them really well. One of the key things that I learned from them was to speak Spanish. I did not ever have a Spanish lesson in my life. I never took it in school, but I started speaking Spanish with them. They were my Spanish teachers, and that has been a very great learning experience. Recently we went to Luciana's wedding in Argentina, and I was able to communicate with her entire family who don't speak English at all. So that's a wonderful thing that we learned from them. Melina is our exchange student from Denmark, and last but not least, our exchange student from Honduras, Judith. So I want to go into a little more detail on our last exchange student, Judith. If you're familiar with the Rotary Exchange Program, you might be aware that Honduras does not actually participate in the exchange program. That's because there are no inbound students, so there can't be any outbound students. The way that this came about was through her father, who is an active Rotarian in Honduras. He has actually done some projects partnering with our local Rotary Club. His daughter was visiting the United States for a Model United Nations session in Washington, D.C., and he asked if there was anyone who would be willing to host her unofficially for a few weeks after she finished her program there. And we said we'd be glad to. They approached us because we had already had so many students, and they knew we would be glad to have another. But through this contact, I got to meet Tony Medina, who is the father. He's a regional director for USGS, and he's the regional director for Central and South America. Because of my contact with Tony, I started learning more about what Rotary actually does with respect to water and sanitation projects. Eventually, he invited me to come to Honduras and participate in a project fair there, which I did. So I owe a lot to this chance meeting with our final exchange student and getting to know a key Rotarian in this region. So one of the things that people ask me is, you are so involved in water, why did you not join Rotary before? I have been a Rotary spouse for a long time, and when I first started going to Rotary meetings, I was under the impression that Rotary was for the bankers and lawyers and people like that, and that there was really not a place for a scientist. And that is not just based on my imagination. I recall a very specific talk by an older Rotarian who talked about classification and listed off all of the people who he felt belonged in Rotary and who didn't. And it made an impression on me. This might be something for Rotarians to think about. It made the impression that it left me was, I did not hear scientists on his list of people who should be Rotarians. And later, when I found that Rotary had a very large interest in water quality, I became kind of confused because my local club had no scientists or engineers or anyone who had really professional training in the water quality industry. And so I was a little bit confused as to why the clubs did not want those types of people in their club. In fact, what had happened is I, of course, had misunderstood the entire classification issue, and Rotary is interested in having those types of people in their club. However, I think they typically don't have that type of representation in a lot of clubs that are trying to do water projects, which is why several years ago I started to get involved through USGS and as an advisory member for a lot of other Rotary clubs. People kind of started using me as a sounding board for ideas for possible issues that came up that they didn't understand. And so I started becoming kind of an advisor to local Rotary clubs that were doing water projects, providing advice and doing what I could to help develop the projects. So during this time, of course, several of the members of our local club said, you know, you really should join Rotary. You could really contribute a lot, which I was glad to hear, but I did not have the ability to take the time out of my day, drive down to where the clubs were, and attend a live face-to-face meeting. So I declined for quite a few years until I found out about the E-Club. The E-Club was ideal for me in two reasons. I had looked at E-Clubs previously because I felt that would be a way I could participate with Rotary, and I felt that also that would be a little bit less of a problem for me not being able to go to the face-to-face club. Then I found out there was an E-Club that actually focused on water and sanitation issues, which is the main thing that I have an interest in with respect to Rotary. So here I am. So I wanted to talk a little bit about some of the other activities that I do. I am very active in the Boy Scouts. I have been ever since I was too old to be a Boy Scout myself. I have been an adult leader for most of my life. I've been a leader of both Cub Scouts and Boy Scouts. I've been a Scoutmaster for a troop for many years. We do a lot of outdoor activities and high adventure, and some of the examples you see here, some map and compass work. But one of the things that Boy Scouts has in common with Rotary is its emphasis on service. On the lower right, you'll see some construction being done by a group of Boy Scouts for a scout who is aspiring to become an Eagle Scout. And service is an essential part of the Boy Scout program, and it fits in very well with the goals of Rotary. Another activity that I participate in is talking to kids in the inner city near where I live about potential careers in the fields of science, technology, engineering, and mathematics, the so-called STEM careers. I try to encourage them to continue their studies and consider careers in those fields. Another activity that takes up some of my spare time is gardening. I enjoy growing my own food, and as you can see, we live in a very fertile part of the country. I wanted to finish up my talk by introducing a word that I've invented. This word uses the root of millionaire, but it's changed a little bit. The word that I have invented is millionator. My goal is to get this entered into the dictionary within the next few years. This is what my new word is going to look like when it gets entered in the dictionary in the next couple of years. Millionator. It's a noun, a person whose good deeds amount to 1 million or more, or a person who has had a positive impact on 1 million people. If you are interested, I have a separate talk on this topic alone. Thank you very much for attending this meeting today.